On Sunday, we heard the story from 1 Samuel chapter 3, in which a little boy named Samuel hears the voice of God speaking to him in the middle of the night, but doesn't realize that it is God's voice. This is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. I love the innocence of Samuel, who is asleep, and God calls out to him, and instead he runs to Eli, the priest, asking, "Why did you call me?" It has this moment of childlike faith, right? But also it echoes the questions that all of us have in our lives. I don't know how many times I have heard throughout my ministry of, how do you hear God's voice in your life? God doesn't speak to me, or at least I don't think God speaks to me. So what am I supposed to be listening for? How do I know it's God who is speaking to me? And my favorite, the one that I get asked the most is, does God still speak to us today? We know that God spoke as we look through the scriptures, but is that something from a long time ago? Or does God still come and speak to regular people like us in this present day? Well, there was this man, and he was having a hard time communicating with his wife. They had been married for years and years, and they were getting up in age, and he was trying to figure out how he could communicate better. And so he decided to try a test, an experiment. He decided he was going to test his wife's hearing. Maybe it was her that was having the problem in this communication piece. And so as she was sitting in a chair reading with her back to him, he stood on the other side of the room, and he said in a normal voice, "Can you hear me now?" And the wife didn't move. She just sat there, and he heard nothing. And so he walked a little bit closer to her, and he said, "Can you hear me now?" Again, she just sat there reading the book, and he heard nothing. So he stepped another few feet closer to her, and he asked the question, "Can you hear me now?" Again, nothing. So finally he got right up behind her, right next to her ear, and he said to her, "Can you hear me now?" And his wife slammed the book, and she looked over her shoulder, and she said, "For the fourth time, yes, I can hear you. What do you want?" Sometimes we believe that the problem is that someone isn't speaking to us, that God does not speak to us today. But God is continually speaking into our world, into our lives. The problem is on our end. The problem with the communication is that we don't often hear or know that it is God's voice that is speaking to us. The story of Samuel is so great because this young boy gets confused about what he is listening to. He believes that the voice that he is hearing is not God's, but Eli's. And it makes me wonder, how many times do we get confused in our lives? How many times is God speaking into our lives, but we attribute it to something else? We attribute it to somebody else saying that to us. Or maybe that's not really what God wants, or God would never ask me to do that. That's too hard for me. And so we dismiss that as God's voice. We think that it is something else that is speaking to us entirely. And we miss that communication that God has for us, that voice that is calling to us, that voice that is trying to lead us. So how do we tune in to God's voice? Well, there's this wonderful story about a country boy who goes to New York City to visit his city friend. So they're walking near Times Square in Manhattan. It's during lunch, about the noon hour. The streets are filled with people. Cars are honking their horns. Taxi cabs are squealing around corners. Sirens are wailing, and the sound of the city is almost deafening. And suddenly that country boy stops and he says, "I hear a cricket." Well, his city friend says, "What? There's no way you can hear a cricket. You must be crazy. You couldn't possibly hear a cricket in all of this noise." And the country boy stops and he listens and he says, No, I'm sure of it. I heard a cricket." Well, again, the city friend's like, that is crazy. But the country boy stops and he listens carefully for a moment, and then he walks across the street to this big cement planter that is there with some shrubs and flowers that are growing. And he looks behind the bushes, beneath the branches, and sure enough, he locates this small cricket. Well, a city friend is utterly amazed. Like, he can't believe that he can hear that cricket, that little noise, over all of the noise of the city. So he says to his friend, "That is incredible. You must have superhuman ears." The country boy looks at him and says, "No, my ears are no different from yours. It all depends on what you're listening for." Well, city friend is like, but that can't be true. I could never hear a cricket in all of this noise. And his country friend says, "Yeah, that is true. It depends on what you're listening for. Here, let me show you." And so he reaches into his pocket and he grabs a handful of coins and he holds it out, and then he drops those coins. And all of a sudden, on the crowded street, you have all of these people who are stopping exactly what they're doing, and they drop down and they begin to look on the sidewalk. You see, with all of that blaring noise, all of the chaos that is going around them, people were tuned in to that change that hits on the street. And so the country boy says, "See what I mean? It all depends on what you're listening for." We know that in our society, there are so many noises that are constantly happening around us. It's hard sometimes to find just a moment of peace and quiet. We have advertisements that are trying to sell us things, trying to tell us who we need to be, trying to tell us what we need to have. We have television shows that are there for entertainment, but also have other purposes, other messages behind them. We have radios, we have cell phones, we have podcasts, all of these things, all of these noises, not to mention social media, right? You have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat and, well, all of the things that are clamoring for our attention. What are you tuned into? Is there even room for God to be able to speak into your life? I know for me personally, I've heard God's voice twice in my life. Twice where I could say that was definitely God's voice speaking to me. It was so loud that it sounded like everyone around could hear, and yet it came from deep within. Like I knew that it wasn't an audible sound, but it was something that was within my spirit, words that were spoken. And I knew that those words did not come from me. But God has also spoken to me in so many quiet moments, and I almost missed them. I think I probably have missed a lot more than I've actually heard. You know, it's in the moment of being on a walk and seeing a butterfly fly around. It's in the moment of somebody who is talking to me and shares with me how they see something going on within my life and affirming that. It comes from watching people interact around me and all of a sudden having clarity or an understanding. Have you heard God's voice speak into your life? What does that sound like for you? Maybe you've never had that experience, or you question if you've ever had that experience. I want to invite you over the next week just to kind of find some quiet space, some time in which you're able just to sit, to be quiet, to ask God to speak to you, to ask God to help you to tune in to that voice that is calling you. Maybe God is telling you that you are loved and beautiful just the way you are. That is a message that we all need to hear. Maybe God is laying upon your heart a need that you see around you. The need for the homeless, or injustices that are happening in your work or in the communities around you. Maybe God is calling you to step into those spaces. Maybe God is calling you into helping lead a mission like Feed My Starving Children that we are hoping to have here in October. And there's a need for team members, and God is trying to put it on your heart to step into that space. Maybe it is a simple yes to going and meeting a neighbor. My friends, I know that God is speaking into our lives. I know God is calling us, but are we tuned in? Are we able to hear God's voice in the midst of all of the noise and the chaos? And if not, how can we take some time to be intentional and say those words that Samuel said? Here I am, God. Here I am. Speak, for your servant is listening.